Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and this is part 2 of our series of highlights from our Board Shareholder Forum. And joining me again for part 2 as my special guest co-host is Cindy Fornelli, who's the Executive Director of the Center for Audit Quality. Welcome, Cindy, back again.
It's glad to be here again, TK. Thank you.
Okay, those of you that missed part 1, you may have to go back and click on that link and see that, but we'll give you just a short review. Last week we held our Board Shareholder Forum, and it was designed to look at the board-shareholder relationship and about communications and engagement, something that our organizations felt was going to be a very major issue. So we wanted to put some effort into, bringing the right people in. We brought a lot of the investors in addition to directors and GCs, corporate secretaries, professionals, proxy solicitors, etc. We had a great thought leadership day about that. And again, I encourage everybody to go back and look at part 1 where we sort of set the stage for what happened. But we wanted to use this to talk about our peer collaboration and sending people off into small groups, and then they subsequently had to come back and report whether there was what the group talked about and were there any findings that could be helpful. So don't you think that was an interesting part of that?
It really was. And what was so unique about the peer collaborations is that in each group you had a cross-section. So it was a multi-disciplined group, if you will. So you had an investor, at least a board member, at least a proxy advisor. So it was a mix of the stakeholders, which I think made the report outs that much more interesting and dynamic and vibrant. So I thought that the process of using that peer collaboration and then having them report out was really informative and educational. So I'm curious, what did you find as the groups reported out? What struck you the most?
What struck me most was, I think every group but one spent time in their session talking about strategy, okay? And no one should be surprised about that, but it's also something that you can only share to a certain point because you can't put yourself at a competitive disadvantage. You can't take strategy and sort of say this is exactly what we're going to do because your competition would react to that. So that's never going to be an area that you can disclose, like you want to disclose. But when you think of it, the logic of it, the board of directors' main responsibilities is the selection and the recruiting and the retention of a CEO and good management team. They need to manage, oversee risk, for the organization, the shareholders, and they need to set direction for the corporation. So it's no surprise that was one of the key things discussed. So that was my observation. How about you when you heard the reporting out?
Well, mine touched on that as well. Mine was really what the definition of whose role and responsibility was what. So we touched a little bit on that, on strategy, right? What was the board's role in setting strategy versus management's role in setting strategy? And then the same thing, what I was particularly interested in were a lot of the groups talked about the communication. Whose responsibility was it to communicate with shareholders? Was it the boards, or was it management, or was it both? And one of the lessons learned, if you will, was that if management could do a better job of communicating with shareholders, because after all, management knows the most about the company, right? Even your best, most experienced board member is not going to know as much about the company and the company's strategy and direction as management. So that if management did a better job of communicating with shareholders, then it would take some of the pressure off of the board for those communications. And when I say better job, I do want to make clear that another theme that emerged throughout the event last week, the forum, was how our legal system puts pressure on those communications, because reports to shareholders become legalistic, and they're legal documents as opposed to communications documents. So that could cause some of the pressure on management not to communicate as clearly as the shareholders would want. But I found that tension interesting. Whose responsibility was it for setting strategy, as you mentioned, and whose responsibility was it for communicating about strategy?
I was a little surprised by the reporting out that a number of them commented that they didn't see that as their responsibility.
The board's responsibility.
Board's responsibility to be communicating with shareholders. And in my perception was that was short-sighted if you see what's happening today. And it almost gets down, it is not illogical that an investor, and particularly an investor with a big position, wants to touch and feel the board. They want to get comfort that either this guy gets it or this board gets it. And you only do that, you only gain that comfort. You can't gain it from a line in the proxy that describes their experience. You want to see that this person gets it. So people that think that they are going to avoid interaction with shareholders going forward, I think is not realistic.
Well, one of the peer groups talked about, and then there was a panel actually afterwards on it, and they got to, if you better define the board's role versus management's role. So if the management's role is to set the strategy and execute on the strategy, and then the board's role is to oversee that strategy, so a stewardship role, maybe what they were talking about is what they're communicating about, so that you would want the communications from management to be about the setting of the strategy and the implementing of the strategy, and you'd want the board's communications to be about how they're overseeing that process, or how they're checking the checks and balances to make sure that management is executing on that strategy. That might be what they were getting at, because I think we heard that throughout the day last week. And I do think you're right. I do think that investors want to hear from management.
I think that became clear, out of the session. Now, another thing that I thought was interesting, and I'd be curious to hear your view on this, there was a fair amount of discussion about the proxy as the tool for communication. And what was your observations from the reporting out on people that talked about the proxy?
Well, I think that people view, as we discussed a little earlier, people view the proxy as a legal document. And I think there was a call by the shareholders saying, yes, we understand that in order to comply with the securities laws, the proxy statement has to look a certain way and contain certain things. However, that doesn't mean that you have to stop there. Why can't companies, as a best practice, in their proxy statements, give more information? And there were some examples that were used. One was, I believe it was GE's.
Right, their summary.
That they had a summary, so that they complied with, their proxy statement looked like what you would expect a securities law proxy statement to look like. But then they had an overlay or a wrapper of a 5-page summary that, in plain English, gave investors or readers of the proxy more information, more direction, not more information, but where to focus and the highlights, if you will, of the proxy statement. And people seem to really like that.
Well, that means you don't have to read
And some people want to read all of those footnotes and those hundreds of pages, but some people just give me the down and dirty, or let me see what's interesting in here that's of importance to me, and then I'll go find it in the longer document.
It was interesting because there was frustration with both from the investor and from the companies to the issue that when laws were written or when something goes on the books or it needs to go on the proxy and we find out that it's not valuable or that nothing can the language can't get changed.
Right.
And they talked about everything from the CEO pay ratio, which is, I don't know how they're going to resolve that, but the things in the proxy like the diversity statement, the compensation risk statement, all those things have proven to be relatively lawyered up and worthless. And there was frustration that said, when we recognize this, there should be a method to solve this faster. And so that's a frustration that was shared on both sides.
Well, and I think a companion to that is that I think most companies, once something goes into the proxy, it never comes out.
Right.
So by definition, they're getting bigger and longer and more complicated as the years go on. Yeah. So it's kind of like the, pardon me, the Hotel California.
Yeah.
Right? Once it goes in, you don't check out.
So to wrap things up, we just got a minute here to go. What was sort of your one takeaway that maybe we haven't discussed, but that might be a good thing for our audience to remember?
Well, what I came away with, my key takeaway, if you will, was the importance of listening more. And we heard that from all of the groups last week, right? That management needs to listen more to investors, that investors need to listen more to the board and to management, that management and the board need to listen more to each other. So
that husbands and wives.
Yes, that was actually an analogy that was used, wasn't it?
Yes.
Husbands and wives and parents and children.
Right.
But that the relationships, there are, we talked about in part one, the tension, but it doesn't have to be unhealthy tension. And if you listen to each other more, you'll have healthy tension.
Yeah.
What was your key takeaway?
Probably that we haven't discussed. I would say the need for boards, particularly boards in this case, to be proactive. You can't sit back. This is an issue that you've got to know your shareholders. You have got to take the initiative and not always be waiting to be reactionary, that there's things that you can do to improve your situation. You need to reach out to the investors at times that aren't in the middle of the proxy season so that you can build the relationship. There is definitely a proactive phase that needs to be part of your thought process as a board of directors. So it was, for me, a very informative and engaging session, and I hope you felt the same way.
Oh, it was fantastic. So I think the challenge will be, how do we take some of these ideas and try to bring them forward and give people best practices or actionable items out of what we heard,
Yeah.
because we had a great group and a great cross-section.
And we will be publishing some information about what came out of this, but you're right. We can't just let it stop. There's something that we have to do to make sure that we follow up, because we had great appreciation from both sides last week, and we want to make sure that we don't just let that drop off the table. So, Cindy, it was a pleasure, having co-hosting this event with you. Thank you for being my special guest co-host.
Thank you
for the
having
last
me.
two shows, and that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show, or the series as it was, two-parter. And we'll be back again next week with another critical topic that will help you be a better board member and committee member. And we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.